So we've done stop dados using the router, and that's one method of doing them. You can do stop dados with a table saw as well. It does require you though to chisel out the remaining section because the blade is a radius, and so it never cuts square up to the end there. So really, the table saw I reserve for when I'm doing through dados, where they go all the way through the piece. And both projects that are happening in Woods 2 have through dados on them at some spot. The stand-up hutch that has the 6 drawers has 3 through dados, and the 2-drawer shaker style box has 1 dado. The division between the 2 drawers there has a through dado. So I want to talk about setting up the dado blade and then how we're going to set up to do those cuts. So first thing, whenever we change the blade, and this is something that you all remember, is that we have to unplug the machine. Okay? Always first, whenever you're going to be working on the blade of the machine or working with the settings of the machine, unplug it. You'll never be upset with yourself for doing it. However, you might be upset with yourself for not doing that, and that's the worst case scenario. So I'll make sure that it is off, that I did unplug the right one. And now I'm going to change this. Now this is a right tilting blade. You can see how it tilts to the right direction. And what that means is that my motor belt is over on the right side here to turn this blade. And that means that I'm going to have a reverse threaded nut. I don't even know if you can buy table saws that are right tilted anymore, because they don't want it to be tilted towards the fence or to the side that's most often used as the fence side. So I'm going to hold the arbor. I'll bring it against the throat plate, the opening here of the throat plate, and then I want to do what generally would be looking like tightening this thing. So I'm turning it in a tightening, so righty tighty. No, and this one is righty loosey. And that's such an uncommon thing that for me to buy a nut for this. Now a nut's generally about 45 cents. This nut here is $20 because this nut has the threading going in the opposite direction that it should really be going, or that it most often is going. Then we have a stiffening washer that goes on here, and then finally our blade. So I'm going to set this up in class. We're all using half-inch dados, through dados. So I'll set it up for a half-inch. The dado blades that I have are all 1/8 of an inch thick. So let me just explain what that means. These are the 2 outside blades, and this is 1/8. Now it does go past 1/8. If you look at the back side of the cutter here, you can see that some of that carbide extends that way, but it's pretty well flush with the opposite side of the blade. This one's labeled the first blade because it goes in first. It's the right side of the blade. The right side has the high point there. Our labeling always goes out, and the carbide cutter faces us. This is my last blade. I'm just going to set it over here for the time being. We don't want to put carbide on a cast iron tabletop because it chips too easily. And these are our chipper blades. So this is the ones that go in between. They space out what the outside blade should be. There are 4 in here, so that's 4/8, it's a half, 5/8, 6/8, or 3/4 of an inch. So with this setup, we do 3/4 of an inch thickness. These sets also come with these wafer-thin spacers, so we can space things out. If what we've planed isn't exactly 3/4 of an inch, it's a little bit over, it's a little bit under, we have different spacers that can go in between here that are going to give us an analog setting kind of thing. Carbide cutter comes towards me. And the carbide cutter can't go up against where there's already a blade. It doesn't sit flat then. You have to have that so that they're offset to some extent, because we want to make sure that there's no gap between the blades there. So how many 8ths is a half-inch? 4, right? So we're going to have 1, 2, 3, and then the other outside blade. Put the stiffener on. And then remember, we're doing reverse. So I'm going to be putting this on and loosening it. Now very often this thing will fall into there, so people are just not used to putting it back on. It drops down, and for myself, who's very used to putting it back on, it'll occasionally happen also. It's nothing to get worried about though, because we have a side door, we just go into it and grab that back out afterwards.
Gotta put that on. Lock that. Just kind of locking it in reverse.
I don't wrench down that so tight that it's going to be difficult to take off, because with this style threading here, as we're cutting, it's actually going to be tightening that nut rather than loosening it, so we don't have to go crazy with how we tighten it. I'll put these nuts back on the dado blade. Now we had a splitter on our old throat plate there, and this was made for one blade to go through. So we have to get a different throat plate to put on here. There's no splitter on this because dado blades are not intended to go actually through the piece of wood. They only go a portion of the way through. So that drops in. I'm going to put dados in this that are going to go maybe on this side here. This is what I showed you for the stop dados before. I'm going to come and I'm going to space my dados on this end here. And I'm going to have my dados be half the thickness. So to find half the thickness, I'll have my middle finger here, and I'm going to go to what I believe is halfway. And I'm going to spin it, and I'm going to reference the other side here. So that I have two lines. So dead center is going to be dead center between those two lines. So I wasn't that far off with what I drew there. That was off enough. So I'm going to go up to that. So I'm going to bring this blade right over here. I'm going to run this down, and I want you to note that I still have this unplugged as I'm doing this. I have this down, and then I can rotate this blade back, and I want to go to the highest point right there, and I'm going to bring that down so it's right in between my two lines. Okay. So that's the depth I want to make. On the center of my roller here, I can turn the middle crank there, and that's going to lock where this is. And I'm going to have it be that I want to space my dados. I'll do my first one because I don't want to hit these brass inserts. So I'll do my first dado 4 inches, my second dado at 7 inches. Okay. Actually, I'm going to go this off. So I'm going to do this 4 inches. Now the other thing is, I have a board that's very long, and I'm only referencing the short end of it. So I could take this, and I would feel reasonably comfortable going across like that. But if this thing turns like this, it's going to put weird pressure on that blade. So I'm not totally comfortable with that. So I'm going to use a miter gauge. The miter gauge is going to help me move it across and keep the thing stable so it's not flopping around on us. Also make sure it's sitting nice and square there. Okay? So I'm going to use the miter gauge in combination with this to keep everything nice and square as I make this cut. One reason I like to use the paddle here, and it's not really an issue with this board here, because this board here came from a manufacturer that used a core in the middle that kept this thing very nice and flat. But a lot of the wood that we have in here has begun to cut, particularly in a year that we're only in here once a week. So I want to make sure that I do keep it down flat. Turn the plug back in. I'm going to hold it like this and like this. I don't want to allow my board to get pushed away from my miter gauge. So if my advancing is done with this hand, all this hand is doing is holding it down as I go through. Again, my legs are right at the stop button here, so as I get through, I'll turn it off. I don't want to bring that back through again. I want to lift that off from the other end there. So I have a dadoe blade, a dadoe cut, that's right to my lines here. And so I want to make the next one 7. So I have 2 grooves here that are parallel to one another. If you're going to find some 1/2 inch material, which I don't readily see, so I'm not going to worry about actually here. Some 1/2 inch MDF. So that 1/2 inch MDF should fit into that. It's a little bit thick. Okay. We also have on the side here with the planer, I have the gauge for all the thicknesses. So when you're planing this, you can get it to the right thickness for your 1/2 inch. So that 1/2 inch should match that 1/2 inch. One thing further to say about this is the shelves that you're putting into the dadoes that you're making in the sides of this should not be cut to final thickness until your dadoes have been cut. So that means that if this was the board I was going to use for the shelf, it's thicker than what my dadoe is right now. That's good, because I want to be able to go back, joint it if it's cupped at all, and then plane it down to that final thickness. So for a 1/2 inch piece, 1/2 inch shelf, if I'm doing it beforehand, prepping that piece of wood, I'll take it to 3/4 of an inch, leaving myself an extra 1/4 of an inch. So then I have a 1/4 of an inch to get it back to flat and to plane it to the thickness that it's going to fit into this dadoe nice and snug.